They marched east with swagger, fueled by Nazi dreams of domination. But beyond the forests of Belarus and the snows of Stalingrad, there was no glory. Only vengeance, starvation, cold. The Soviet front did not just kill German soldiers, it crushed them, broke them, and buried them in silence. This is the fate they never expected to live or die for. On June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the most massive military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers flooded into the Soviet Union, driven by Hitler's vision of conquest and racial domination. They believed victory was inevitable, that the Soviet people were inferior, that winter would be short. They were wrong, fatally wrong. The Soviet front turned into a frozen graveyard. Here, ideology collided with brutal resistance. German soldiers found themselves trapped in endless forests, bogged down in mud, tormented by partisans, and eventually surrounded by an enemy that refused to break. At places like Stalingrad and Kursk, their confidence shattered. Starvation, frostbite, psychological collapse, and captivity awaited the survivors. Tens of thousands would never return, not because of battlefield wounds, but because of what came after. This is not the story the Third Reich wanted to tell. This is the side of World War II, often buried beneath myths and propaganda. So, what exactly was the horrifying fate of Nazi soldiers on the Soviet front? And how did one of the world's most feared armies meet such a brutal and humiliating end? Let's uncover the truth. Chapter 1. Barbarossa's frozen blitzkrieg. They thought it would take weeks. It took years. At dawn on June 22nd, 1941, the German war machine surged forward in its most ambitious assault yet, Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest land invasion in human history. Over 3 million Axis soldiers, primarily Germans, poured across the border into the Soviet Union. Tanks thundered ahead. Aircraft filled the skies. Boots marched in rhythm across open fields and pine forests. Hitler believed the war would be over by Christmas. The Nazi regime called it a crusade, a war of racial cleansing, a mission to crush Bolshevism and claim Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. Soldiers carried with them not only rifles and rations, but an ideology that labeled Slavs, Jews, and communists as subhuman. They believed the Soviets would collapse like a rotted house. They believed the Red Army was backward, poorly led, and unprepared. And at first, they were right. In the opening weeks, the Wehrmacht moved like a blade through soft flesh. Soviet forces were uncoordinated and poorly positioned. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in a matter of days. German panzer divisions swept around entire Soviet armies, cutting off retreat and supply. By the end of July, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured. Long columns of prisoners shuffled westward, barefoot, starving, silent. German officers sent letters home declaring imminent victory. Propaganda films showed triumphant soldiers standing over scorched villages and captured cities. The confidence was blinding. Civilians were either ignored or executed. Jewish communities were eradicated within weeks. German soldiers believed they were advancing into a world of inferiors, something barely human. But behind those burning towns, a different war had already begun. The deeper the Germans moved, the more the land began to fight back. Supply lines stretched thin. Roads vanished into endless forests. Maps were useless. Rain turned fields into swamps. And from the trees came shadows. Partisans, resistance fighters, often armed with nothing but stolen rifles and homemade explosives. They attacked at night, sabotaged rail lines, and vanished into the woods. They were farmers, teachers, teenagers, often entire families, taking up arms. The Wehrmacht was not prepared for this. Their tanks weren't built for this terrain. Their rations were dwindling, Ammunition had to be carried across hundreds of miles. Every village had to be cleared, every train had to be guarded, and every day the men were growing tired. Then the seasons changed. As autumn turned to winter, the momentum slowed, the roads froze, then vanished under thick sheets of snow. German vehicles began to seize up. Lubricants turned to jelly. Fuel froze inside tanks. Soldiers' breath turned into icicles on their lashes. They wrapped their feet in newspaper and burlap. Their greatcoats were too thin. Most had no gloves. The army that had raced across Europe now stood shivering in the Russian wilderness. They were still only miles from Moscow, and many believed they would take it, but Moscow never fell. Instead, the Soviets struck back. Entire divisions from Siberia, seasoned in the brutal cold, arrived by train. These soldiers wore white camouflage, moved in silence, and attacked with ferocity the Germans had never seen. The counterattacks were devastating. Whole regiments were wiped out overnight. Artillery rained down from frozen forests. Soviet tanks moved across frozen rivers, encircling the invaders. The German lines, stretched and brittle, began to fracture. Then came the real enemy, winter. Temperatures dropped to -30, then -40. Soldiers froze to death in their foxholes. Trenches became icy tombs. Wounds turned black. Fingers and toes snapped off like twigs. There was no firewood, no shelter, no relief. They boiled leather belts and dead horses for food. Some even turned on their comrades. In this new phase of the war, bullets were not the deadliest killers. Hunger, frostbite, disease, and despair claimed thousands. Entire divisions withered away without a single shot fired. Medical supplies had run out. Morphine was gone. Bandages were scarce. German medics were forced to amputate limbs with rusted blades, and still the orders were clear: no retreat. Hitler refused to acknowledge the collapse. His obsession with holding ground led to disaster. Commanders pleaded for withdrawal. He called them cowards. Units were ordered to fight to the last man, even when surrounded. In one infamous instance, an entire corps dug into the snow with bayonets and frozen spoons, defending a village that no longer existed on a map. Soldiers wrote home, but their letters grew strange. Some described hallucinations, ghosts in the trees, voices in the wind. One private scrawled, "The snow speaks to me now. It tells me I won't see spring." Many stopped writing altogether. Their hands were too frozen to hold a pen. What had started as a confident campaign had become a living nightmare. The German soldier, the mythic figure of Nazi propaganda, was now a gaunt, hollow-eyed survivor, barely clinging to life. And the spring thaw brought no mercy. When the snow melted, it left behind oceans of mud. Tanks sank to their turrets. Trucks vanished beneath the muck. Men lost their boots and marched barefoot. Supply convoys stalled. Disease returned. Rats spread typhus. Dysentery tore through entire units. Still, they held the line, what was left of it. They had entered the Soviet Union as conquerors. Now they were scavengers, eating bark off trees, killing their own horses for meat, watching comrades collapse and never rise again. One young officer kept a diary against orders. In a final entry before his capture, he wrote, "We came to Russia as gods. Now we pray for death." Even the prisoners knew what was coming. Those who were captured were marched east, beaten, stripped of their coats, and thrown into frozen trains. Many never reached the camps. Those who did would face new horrors: forced labor, starvation, typhus, frostbite. But that was still ahead. For now, on the vast killing fields of the Soviet front, the blitzkrieg had frozen solid. And the horrifying fate of the German soldier had only just begun. Chapter 2, Winter Hell and the Siege of Stalingrad. The German 6th Army, over 300,000 strong, had been sent to take Stalingrad and secure the oil fields beyond. Hitler saw it not only as a strategic target, but as a symbol. A city named after Stalin must fall, no matter the cost. So they marched, crossing steppes and shattered villages, chasing a mirage of victory. As they approached Stalingrad in late summer, the city was already in ruins. Luftwaffe bombers turned entire blocks into rubble. Fires burned for days. Civilians, those who could not flee, dug shelters beneath their homes. By the time the Germans entered the city, they believed the worst was behind them. They were wrong. Stalingrad was not a city, it was a trap. A death maze of collapsed buildings, sewer tunnels, sniper nests, and industrial wreckage. Soviet defenders had burrowed into every floor, every stairwell, every chimney. Machine guns rattled from hidden corners. Mines were buried beneath the rubble. Snipers picked off soldiers from rooftops, disappearing before they could be found. Every street was a battlefield, every room a coffin. German infantry had trained for open warfare, blitzkrieg tactics, fast movement, combined arms. But here, in the skeleton of Stalingrad, they had to crawl on their stomachs, kick in doors, fight hand-to-hand for staircases. They called it the Rattenkrieg, rat war. Knives, pistols, shovels, bare hands, anything was used to kill. Battles were fought over the same building for weeks. Men died for ground measured in meters. The Soviets would not break. Civilians joined the fight. Nurses carried rifles. Boys threw grenades. Women crawled through the pipes beneath factories to carry ammunition. Soviet officers executed deserters on the spot. To retreat was to die. To advance was to die. But they did not stop. The Germans advanced inch by inch, but each block they gained cost blood, and behind them, the Soviet commander Zhukov was preparing something far worse. As the autumn rains turned to snow, the trap was sprung. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement. They did not strike the German front directly. Instead, they hit the flanks. Romanian and Hungarian units poorly equipped and stretched too thin. Within days, the noose tightened around Stalingrad. The entire German Sixth Army, more than 250,000 men, was surrounded. Panic spread quickly. Radios buzzed with desperate calls. Commanders begged Hitler for permission to retreat. He refused. He promised supplies by air. It was a lie. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver a fraction of what the trapped army needed. Planes were shot down or frozen on the runway. What little arrived was too late, too little. Moldy bread, frozen potatoes, some ammunition. Inside the city, rations dwindled to nothing. Soldiers began eating the meat from dead horses. Then they boiled leather straps, then books, then rats. Frostbite turned fingers black. Boots froze solid. Uniforms crawled with lice. Trenches became mass graves. Tents collapsed under snow. Men slept beside corpses for warmth. Hygiene disappeared. So did sanity. One soldier wrote, "We no longer bury our dead. We eat beside them. We sleep beside them. Soon we will be like them." Discipline collapsed. Some deserted and were shot. Others wandered into no man's land, hoping the Soviets would capture them. Few were so lucky. Most were gunned down, torn apart by artillery, or simply vanished in the snow. In the final weeks, soldiers stopped writing home. They had no paper, no ink, no hope. On January 31st, 1943, German General Friedrich Paulus surrendered. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal the day before, hinting that no German officer of that rank had ever surrendered. Paulus refused to kill himself. He surrendered with 91,000 men, most of them half dead. The Soviets took the survivors east. They were marched through the snow, across endless plains, toward camps deep in the Russian interior. Along the way, thousands dropped from exhaustion or cold. The guards did not stop. The columns kept moving. Those who fell were shot or left to freeze. When they reached the camps, what waited for them was not safety. It was more death. They were packed into barracks with no heat. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. There was no medicine. Men shared lice-infested blankets. They ate watery soup and moldy bread. Some worked in coal mines, others in forests. Beatings were common. Letters were rare. Of the 91,000 men captured at Stalingrad, only around 5,000 would ever see Germany again. It took over a decade. The fate of the 6th Army became a symbol, not of German strength, but of total collapse. It was the moment the world saw the myth of Nazi invincibility shatter. And for the soldiers who survived, the psychological scars never faded. Those who returned spoke of nightmares, screaming winds, frozen corpses, the smell of burning flesh, the sound of boots crunching through the snow. They were not welcomed as heroes. They were not welcomed at all. Many were branded traitors. Others simply vanished back into silence. But the memory of Stalingrad remained. It haunted every German soldier who marched east in the years that followed. It reminded them that the Soviet front was not a war. It was a sentence. For those still fighting on Russian soil, there was now no illusion of glory, no dream of swift victory, only the cold, only hunger, only death, and the horrifying fate of Nazi soldiers was just getting started. Chapter 3, Captivity, Collapse, and Mass Death. Captivity in the Soviet Union was not survival. It was a prolonged form of dying. The Red Army, reeling from the Nazi siege, had no infrastructure for mass imprisonment. The Soviet rail network was crippled. Cities had been burned. Farms were fallow. And yet, prisoners poured in by the tens of thousands, filthy, starving, often wounded, coughing blood into rags or stumbling on frost-bitten feet. There were no Red Cross inspections, no Geneva Convention protections, only the bitter irony that the Wehrmacht, which had treated Soviet POWs as disposable subhumans, now found itself at the mercy of the very system it had helped destroy. And the system did not forget. The first step was the march. Columns of prisoners, some barefoot, limped through the snow. They were given no food, no water, just a direction and orders to keep moving. Soviet guards barked in Russian, beat stragglers with rifle butts, and shot those who collapsed. Men leaned on each other like broken scaffolding. Some dragged wounded comrades for miles. Others slipped into ditches, curled up, and never moved again. At night, there were no tents, just open fields, snow for pillows. If a soldier fell asleep, he risked not waking up. The cold did not forgive. Some survivors remembered cannibalism. In the desperate weeks following surrender, they said corpses were not always buried, and when food was gone and hunger overpowered revulsion, men did the unthinkable. The guards did not care. To them, these were fascists, killers, invaders who had razed entire towns, shot partisans, burned crops, and executed civilians. Compassion had died with their families. Now, vengeance marched with their boots. Those who survived the winter treks arrived at POW transit camps, not camps really, but holding pens, barbed wire, mud, wooden barracks black with soot and lice, no insulation, a hole in the ground for a toilet, and a ladle of watery soup each day. If you were lucky, bread. Sickness swept through like fire. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, pneumonia. Bodies twitched in fever, vomited blood, seized and stilled. Sometimes a whole bunk of men died in a single night. One Soviet medic wrote grimly, "They came in broken. The strongest lasted a month. The rest we carried out each morning." Then came the interrogations. The Soviets wanted names, officers, SS men, anyone tied to the Einsatzgruppen, to anti-partisan units, to the Gestapo. Prisoners were sorted, questioned, divided. Those identified as war criminals vanished. Some were shot in woods. Others were shipped to the gulags, never to be seen again. The rest were sent deeper into the Soviet interior, to forced labor camps, to coal mines in Siberia, to forests in Karelia, to factories near Moscow. Wherever labor was needed, prisoners were shipped. Trains rumbled through frozen landscapes. Boxcars unheated, airless. Men huddled for warmth. Some froze to the walls. Others died standing. Those who reached the camps were met not with relief, but with orders, shovels, axes, picks. They worked 10 to 12 hours a day in temperatures that cracked skin and split fingernails. Gloves were rare. Boots were often made of paper and rope. Meals were identical every day. Watery soup, cabbage, and a hunk of black bread if you worked hard enough. Miss a shift, get beaten. Collapse, get beaten harder. Die, you'd be replaced. Discipline was absolute. If one man tried to escape, 10 would be punished. If one man stole bread, 20 would go hungry. And the threat of execution hung over everything. Even suicide was watched. The guards wanted bodies to work, not to rot. One prisoner, Karl Müller, later recalled, "It was not captivity. It was a slow-motion death sentence. You did not live each day. You survived each hour." But perhaps the most brutal suffering was not physical. It was a psychological collapse. For many German soldiers, their minds shattered in captivity. They had marched east with images of Aryan superiority, of swift victory, of Russian inferiority. Instead, they now shoveled snow for 10 hours a day, begged for scraps, coughed up blood, and watched friends die nameless deaths. Some clung to ideology. They whispered that Hitler would rescue them, that new weapons were coming, that surrender had been a trick. Others abandoned all hope. They stopped speaking, stared into the frost, died with their eyes open. Letters, if they ever arrived, were censored and rare. Most families back in Germany believed them dead for years. Wives remarried, parents grieved, children forgot. Some prisoners spent more than a decade in the Gulag system. After the war ended in 1945, the camps did not immediately empty. Stalin saw German POWs as tools to rebuild shattered cities, to work in mines, to serve the same state they had tried to destroy. The Allies asked for their release. Moscow stalled. It was not until the 1950s, almost a decade later, that the last large group of German POWs was repatriated. Of the nearly 3.5 million Wehrmacht soldiers taken prisoner by the Soviets during the war, over 1.1 million died in captivity. Many were never recorded. No graves, no names, just rows of frost-covered uniforms in unmarked soil. Back in Germany, the survivors returned to a land they no longer recognized. Cities had been bombed flat. The Reich had collapsed. Hitler was dead. The Nazi Party banned. The world had moved on. And the returning POWs? They were not greeted with sympathy. Many were accused of complicity in war crimes. Others were viewed as contaminated, brainwashed by Soviet propaganda. Still others simply could not speak of what they had seen. They suffered quietly. PTSD, then called war neurosis, haunted them. Some woke up screaming. Others refused to sleep indoors. Many drank. Many never married. They lived in a kind of suspended sentence, freed from Russia, but never truly home. In East Germany, the communist regime tried to use returning POWs as symbols of rehabilitation. They were asked to speak of Soviet mercy. Many refused. Some vanished again, this time into Stasi prisons. In West Germany, the Cold War buried their trauma. The focus was rebuilding, not remembering. The silence grew heavier with each passing year. But in rare memoirs, fragments of truth emerged. One soldier described watching a friend strangle himself with a belt to avoid another day in the mines. Another recalled trading a wedding ring for a slice of bread, then beating a man half to death for trying to steal it. Another wrote only one line in his diary before burning it: "There are no animals in the camps. We are animals." The scale of death was immense, but so was the dehumanization. The Nazi war machine had expected to conquer Russia in weeks. Instead, it fed its soldiers into a furnace of vengeance, frost, and starvation. And when they were captured, there was no rescue, no Red Cross parcels, no mercy. Just the long march into oblivion. The horror of the Eastern Front did not end with gunfire. It lived on in the gulags, in the minds of broken men, in the silence of post-war Europe, and for every German family that waited for a knock on the door, a letter, a grave. Most waited forever. The Soviet Union had absorbed their sons, their fathers, their husbands, not as prisoners of war, but as punishment incarnate, and the punishment never really ended. Here is Chapter 4, Avenging the Wehrmacht, Soviet Reprisals and Frontline Death, a 1,500-word continuation of your documentary, The Horrifying Fate of Nazi Soldiers on the Soviet Front. Tone: cinematic, brutal, and historically immersive. Continuity is preserved. No basic repetition, just a seamless escalation of horror. Chapter 4, Avenging the Wehrmacht, Soviet Reprisals and Frontline Death. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The red arrows on Soviet maps no longer pointed backward. The Red Army, once retreating from Minsk to Moscow, was now pushing west with fury, liberating charred villages, shattered cities, and mass graves. But this was not just a military advance. It was vengeance on a continental scale. The German Wehrmacht had marched into the Soviet Union under banners of annihilation, guided by orders that dehumanized Slavs, Jews, and communists alike. Now, every inch of ground retaken by Soviet soldiers came soaked with memories of the atrocities inflicted on their families, their homes, their people. And they returned not with mercy, but with fire. On the front lines, this vengeance was immediate. German soldiers, those too wounded to flee, too weak to resist, were rarely taken prisoner. Many were shot where they lay, bayoneted in trenches, or buried alive in collapsing bunkers. Surrender did not always mean survival. Reports from advancing Soviet divisions speak of entire Wehrmacht units that attempted to give up, only to be mowed down minutes later. Rifle bursts into the backs of kneeling men. Grenades rolled into dugouts after white flags were waved. No quarter for Soviet soldiers who had seen their families burned in barns or starved in ghettos. It was not cruelty, it was justice. A Red Army captain near Vitebsk wrote, "They shot my sister. She was 7. I gave no orders to spare anyone." These moments were not isolated. As the Soviet lines moved through Ukraine, Belarus, and eastern Poland, they uncovered death camps, execution sites, and forests of unmarked graves. The stench of mass murder hung in the trees. Villagers described how Wehrmacht officers had lined up Jews, women, children, and executed them over ditches. The soldiers who uncovered these crimes often stopped writing home. Their letters, when they did write, grew shorter, more raw. One simply said, "I cannot explain to you what I've seen. I can only say that I do not care if any of them live." And so the killing intensified. The partisan warfare behind German lines had long been brutal, but now it transformed. Soviet partisans began capturing isolated patrols and executing them en masse. German trains were derailed, and the survivors were hung from trees. Mines were planted beneath footpaths. Forests became graveyards. But perhaps the most horrifying fate awaited those caught retreating. As the Wehrmacht fell back from the Dnieper River and later from Belarus, order disintegrated. Command posts vanished. Radios went silent. The cold came again. Men starved, wandered, froze. They stumbled through burning towns with frost-bitten feet and empty rifles. And when the Soviets caught them, there was no trial. A medic from the Soviet First Belarusian Front recalled, "They crawled out of cellars with white cloths. We shot them anyway. We had no use for Nazis." German officers often fared worse. Identified by their insignia or medals, they were sometimes stripped, tied to trees, and left to freeze. Others were marched through villages, spat on by peasants, and then executed in front of cheering crowds. There were reports, some unconfirmed, others too frequent to dismiss, of mutilation, torture, and mass shootings of POWs in reprisal for what had been done in occupied Soviet territories. It was not an official policy, but it was a common reality. For the average German soldier, survival meant retreating faster than the Red Army could advance. But retreat itself was chaos. Roads were jammed with broken trucks, limping horses, and corpses half buried in snowbanks. Supplies never came. Fuel was stolen. Discipline collapsed. Officers screamed orders at ghosts. Artillery barrages fell behind their own lines, and all the while the Soviet war machine grew louder. The Red Army now had overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, and planes. T-34s thundered through frozen forest. Katyusha rockets lit up the night sky with screaming hellfire. Soviet infantry advanced behind waves of artillery, stepping over corpses with rifles clenched in numb hands. There was no pause, no rest, no safe zone. At Korsun, Narva, Lviv, East Prussia, the pattern repeated: encirclement, shelling, massacre. The Germans were no longer waging a war. They were running from it. Some tried to desert. Civilians shaved their heads, changed into peasant clothes, hid in barns. But even this was dangerous. The Soviets did not always distinguish between Wehrmacht and SS, between frontline soldier and rear guard. The uniform was enough. By late 1944, in Poland, in Silesia, in Hungary, thousands of German troops died not in glorious battle, but in muddy alleys, burning houses, frozen rivers, shell-shocked, starving, terrified. Estimates suggest over 4.1 million German soldiers died on the Eastern Front, a staggering number. And it was not disease or hunger alone. It was this constant, merciless grind of frontline slaughter, retreat, and reprisal. Even when soldiers tried to flee westward toward surrender to the Americans or British, they often found themselves cut off. The Red Army moved too fast, German command too slowly. Maps became useless. Bridges exploded before their eyes. Towns they sought for shelter were already burning. And those who did surrender to the Soviets in the final months, many were executed quietly, shot in the woods, tossed into shell craters, recorded as missing in action. A Soviet infantryman at the Oder River remembered, "We took a trench. 6 Germans inside. They held up their hands. My friend Sergei shot them all. Then he lit a cigarette and sat down." This was not madness. It was history boiling over. Every atrocity committed during Barbarossa returned like a hammer. Every village burned. Every civilian hung. Every partisan executed came back multiplied. The ratio of losses also told a story. In the early war years, it took 6 or 7 Soviet lives to kill a single German soldier. But by 1944, the ratio had narrowed. Soviet strategy matured, their armor overwhelmed, their supply lines stretched deep into Europe. By the end, the Germans were losing men nearly 1-for-1, a disaster for an already exhausted army. And it was not only soldiers who paid the price. German civilians in East Prussia and Pomerania fled in panicked columns, hoping to escape the Soviet wrath, but many were caught, shot, or worse. That part of the story, the fate of civilians, belongs to a darker chapter still. But for the men in uniform, there was no safe ending. Whether they died under a T-34, froze in a foxhole, bled out in a burning farmhouse, or knelt before a Soviet firing squad, their fate was sealed the moment they crossed into Russia. The Eastern Front did not forgive. It was consumed. And for the Wehrmacht, it would remain the single largest graveyard in history, a place where ideology, arrogance, and brutality met their brutal reckoning. Chapter 5, Ideology versus Reality, the collapse of the clean Wehrmacht myth. They had marched east believing they were heroes. The German soldiers of 1941 were not reluctant conscripts. Many were young, proud, and filled with purpose, raised under Hitler's regime, steeped in nationalist propaganda, told they were liberators, carriers of civilization into the Bolshevik wilderness. They believed this war was righteous. But belief would not stop the snow from falling. It would not stop their fingers from blackening with frostbite, nor keep lice from burrowing into their collars, nor silence the screams echoing from burning barns. And in the end, it would not protect them from the collapse of the very myth that had sent them to war. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht. For decades after the war, many Germans clung to the idea that the regular army, the Wehrmacht, had fought with honor, that the real criminals were the SS, the Gestapo, the Nazi elite, that soldiers had merely followed orders, done their duty, suffered like any other. But the documents tell a different story. So do the graves. So do the civilians who watched their villages disappear in flames. From the very beginning, the invasion of the Soviet Union was no ordinary war. It was a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. German soldiers were not simply told to defeat an enemy. They were told to unmake a people. The Barbarossa decree, issued before the invasion, stripped Soviet civilians of legal protection. German soldiers were told they would not be punished for acts of violence, theft, or execution. Commanders were encouraged to deal with partisans ruthlessly, which in practice meant shooting men, women, and even children. The Commissar order went further. Political officers in the Red Army, identified by their insignia, were to be executed immediately upon capture. No trial, no records, just a bullet and a ditch. And the Wehrmacht followed through. In the forests of Belarus, in the towns of Ukraine, in the river crossings of Western Russia, German troops shot prisoners, razed villages, deported civilians, and starved millions. They watched as the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi death squads, rounded up Jews and executed them in open pits, and often they helped. Some provided security, others dug the graves, a few pulled the triggers themselves. In many towns, Wehrmacht soldiers handed over Jews to the SS, or simply killed them first. Letters sent home reveal not just knowledge, but pride. One soldier wrote, "We cleared the village. All partisans and Jews were taken care of. The streets are clean now." The myth of moral detachment of the noble German soldier who kept his hands clean began to crack. But it shattered completely in the long retreat. As the Wehrmacht pulled back from the Volga, the Dnieper, and finally the Vistula, their actions grew more desperate and more brutal. Scorched earth orders were issued. If a village could not be held, it was to be destroyed. Livestock were slaughtered, wells poisoned, civilians shot or deported. Anything of value was burned. Entire regions were turned into ash to deny the Soviets resources, but also to punish those deemed unworthy of mercy. It was not a war of soldiers anymore. It was a war of vengeance, and it was mutual. German units burned houses with people still inside. They mined the bodies of dead civilians. They used slave labor from occupied populations, often working them to death. Tens of thousands of Soviet civilians were deported to Germany to work in factories under appalling conditions. Many never returned. As the Red Army advanced, they found the evidence: photographs, orders, skeletons. They also found survivors: children with sunken eyes, women with torn clothes, men with missing fingers and haunted stares. These discoveries erased any illusion of a clean enemy. The Red Army's own vengeance, as brutal as it became, was forged in the fires lit by the Wehrmacht. And yet, after the war, the narrative changed. Many German POWs returning from Soviet captivity, if they survived at all, spoke of hardship, of suffering, of innocence. They said they had not known what the SS was doing, that they had simply fought, that they had nothing to do with the mass graves. The West, now locked in a Cold War with the Soviets, found it convenient to believe them. In West Germany, former officers were reabsorbed into the new Bundeswehr. Some became politicians. Others wrote memoirs painting their service as tragic, misunderstood. School books avoided the worst chapters. Hollywood, too, often separated the Wehrmacht from the Nazi machine. But historians refused to forget. In the 1990s, the Wehrmacht exhibition toured Germany, displaying irrefutable proof: photos, orders, testimonies of Army complicity in war crimes. The public was shocked. Some protested, but the truth had broken through the silence. The myth was dead, and yet the cost was already paid. The soldiers who had once marched east with fanfare had long since become bones beneath Russian soil. Many had truly believed they were invincible, that their ideology would carry them through the snow, that their cause was just. Instead, they starved. They froze. They were hunted down in forests, gunned down in marshes, torn apart by artillery in nameless fields. Some surrendered and were worked to death in Soviet mines. Others simply vanished, swallowed by the front, by the mud, by the fire. Their fate was not clean. It was not noble. It was not heroic. It was the consequence of belief, of following orders without question, of embracing myths that turned men into machines, and then abandoned them when the gears broke. One veteran, interviewed decades later, put it simply: "We thought we were the hammer. We didn't realize we were the nails." The collapse of the Wehrmacht myth was not just about reputation, it was about reckoning. It forced a country to confront the reality that its sons had not just died. They had killed, they had participated, they had helped build the furnace that consumed them, and it left a legacy of silence. Many veterans never spoke of what they saw. Some took secrets to their graves. Others denied everything, but a few broke the silence. One wrote in his final letter, "We buried the truth under snow, but it always melts." In the end, the horrifying fate of Nazi soldiers on the Soviet front was not just frostbite, starvation, captivity, or death. It was the slow unraveling of a lie, the realization that they were not the saviors of Europe, but the executioners of its soul. and that no amount of uniforms, medals, or orders could wash the blood from the ice. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe for more untold history and share it with someone who needs to know the truth. See you in the next video.